Pratain, my friend, this is a new total philosophy video. Today we begin the critique of pure reason at the exact point where Kant sets the rules of the game. This first section looks simple, but it is doing something decisive. It asks where human knowledge comes from, and whether the mind contributes anything of its own beyond what the senses deliver. Kant starts from a common sense claim. Knowledge begins with experience, but immediately warns us not to confuse begins with and comes entirely from. From there, he introduces the distinction between empirical knowledge, that is a posteriori, and knowledge that is independent of experience, that is a priori, and he tightens these terms so we do not use them loosely. If this sounds technical, that is because Kant is building the foundation for everything that follows. Before he can argue about metaphysics, he first has to clarify what counts as a legitimate source of knowledge. Let's start the reading.
Introduction, Part 1, of the difference between pure and empirical knowledge. That all our knowledge begins with experience, there can be no doubt. For how is it possible that the faculty of cognition should be awakened into exercise otherwise than by means of objects which affect our senses, and partly of themselves produce representations, partly rouse our powers of understanding into activity, to compare, to connect, or to separate these, and so to convert the raw material of our sensuous impressions into a knowledge of objects, which is called experience? In respect of time, therefore, no knowledge of ours is antecedent to experience, but begins with it.
Kant starts from a very down-to-earth point. You do not begin life already knowing. Your mind only starts working as a knowing mind when the world hits your senses: light, sound, touch, pain, warmth, movement. Those sensory impacts create basic impressions in you. Then your mind does something active with them. It compares impressions, connects them, separates them, and organizes them until they become objects you recognize, like a chair, a person, a falling cup. That organized result is what Kant calls experience. So his conclusion is strictly about timing. Experience comes first, and only after that does knowledge begin.
But though all our knowledge begins with experience, it by no means follows that all arises out of experience. For on the contrary, it is quite possible that our empirical knowledge is a compound of that which we receive through impressions, and that which the faculty of cognition supplies from itself, sensuous impressions giving merely the occasion, an addition which we cannot distinguish from the original element given by sense, till long practice has made us attentive to and skillful in separating it. It is therefore a question which requires close investigation, and not to be answered at first sight, whether there exists a knowledge altogether independent of experience, and even of all sensuous impressions. Knowledge of this kind is called a priori, in contradistinction to empirical knowledge, which has its sources a posteriori, that is, in experience.
Kant's next move is subtle but important. Even if experience is what starts our knowledge, it does not automatically mean that experience is the only source of knowledge. He suggests that what we call experience-based knowledge may actually be a blend of two ingredients. One, what the senses deliver, colors, sounds, pressures, sensations, and two, what the mind contributes on its own, ways of organizing, structuring, and interpreting those sensations. The tricky part is that we usually cannot tell these two apart. The mind's contribution is so automatic and so tightly mixed in that it feels like it is simply out there in the world, when in fact it may be partly coming from how we are built to think. Because of that, Kant says we need a careful investigation. Is there any knowledge that is completely independent of experience? Knowledge that does not come from the senses at all? He gives names to the two sides of the contrast. If knowledge is independent of experience, he calls it a priori. If knowledge comes from experience, he calls it a posteriori or empirical. This paragraph sets up the main question of the book. What does the mind supply from itself, and what truly comes from the world through the senses?
But the expression a priori is not as yet definite enough adequately to indicate the whole meaning of the question above started. For in speaking of knowledge, which has its sources in experience, we are wont to say that this or that may be known a priori, because we do not derive this knowledge immediately from experience, but from a general rule, which, however, we have itself borrowed from experience. Thus, if a man undermined his house, we say, he might know a priori that it would have fallen. That is, he needed not to have waited for the experience that it did actually fall. But still, a priori, he could not know even this much. For that bodies are heavy, and consequently that they fall when their supports are taken away, must have been known to him previously by means of experience.
Kant is warning you that people use the phrase a priori in a sloppy way, and that can confuse the whole debate. In everyday speech, we sometimes say we knew it in advance just because we did not have to watch a specific event happen. For example, if someone destroys the supports of a house, we say he could know beforehand that the house would fall, because he does not need to wait for the collapse to learn the outcome. But Kant says that is not truly a priori in the strict sense. The prediction depends on background knowledge you only get from experience, like learning that heavy objects fall when their supports are removed. So even though you didn't need to witness this particular house falling, your confidence still rests on lessons you learned from the world. Kant's point is, not needing to wait for a specific event is not the same as being independent of experience.
By the term knowledge a priori, therefore, we shall in the sequel understand not such as is independent of this or that kind of experience, but such as is absolutely so of all experience. Opposed to this is empirical knowledge, or that which is possible only a posteriori, that is, through experience. Knowledge a priori is either pure or impure. Pure knowledge a priori is that with which no empirical element is mixed up. For example, the proposition, every change has a cause, is a proposition a priori, but impure, because change is a conception which can only be derived from experience.
Kant now locks in his definitions because the whole book depends on them. When he says a priori knowledge, he does not mean knowledge that doesn't rely on this specific experience. He means knowledge that does not rely on any experience at all, nothing learned by the senses, directly or indirectly. The opposite is empirical, a posteriori knowledge, which you can only get by experiencing the world. Then he adds a finer distinction. Even within a priori knowledge, some is pure and some is impure. Pure a priori knowledge contains no ingredients borrowed from experience, not even in the concepts it uses. Impure a priori knowledge may state a necessary rule, but it still uses some concept that originally comes from experience. His example is, every change has a cause. Kant treats this as an a priori style principle. It claims necessity, not just usually. But it is impure because the concept of change comes from experience. You only get the idea of change by observing things that alter over time. So the rule aims beyond mere observation, yet it still contains an experience-based concept. In this section that we read and commented now, we saw Kant build a careful ladder of distinctions. First, he affirmed that experience is the trigger that awakens cognition. The senses provide raw impressions, and the understanding actively organizes them into recognizable objects. But then he introduced the real problem. Even if experience starts our knowing, our knowledge may still be a mixture of what we receive through sensation and what the mind supplies from itself, and it takes discipline to separate those two components. That is why he introduces a priori knowledge as knowledge independent of all experience, contrasting it with a posteriori knowledge that depends on experience. And he warns against the everyday misuse of a priori as mere prediction from past observation. Finally, he adds a crucial refinement. A priori knowledge can be pure or impure, depending on whether it includes concepts drawn from experience. So even a principle like every change has a cause is a priori in its claim to necessity, yet impure because the concept of change comes from experience. By the end of this section, Kant has not yet proven his system, but he has set the definitions and the target. The investigation will be about what the mind contributes, what experience contributes, and how far reason can legitimately go. In the next video, we will read and understand the second section of the introduction. The human intellect, even in an unphilosophical state, is in possession of certain cognitions a priori. See you soon.